The year was 1850, and Miss Eliza Marrow arrived at Thistledown Hall with a trunk full of linen and a head full of rules. The school loomed above the foggy hedgerows like an old judgment. Ivy clung to its stone-like secrets, and the windows reflected nothing but grey skies and discipline. Thistledown was not a place for the curious or spirited. It was a place for reform, for quieting girls who had ideas about books they shouldn't read, questions they shouldn't ask, and feelings that had no place in polite society. Eliza was 16. She had a reputation for too much imagination and too many observations. Her mother sent her here after discovering a rather poetic diary entry about the stable boy back home. It wasn't obscene, not really, just honest. But in 1850, honesty was its own kind of sin. Upon arrival, she was met by Mrs. Hargrave, the school's headmistress. Her face was lined like a page folded too many times, and her eyes looked through people rather than at them. She wore all black, even in daylight, and smelled faintly of lavender water and starch. "Welcome to Thistledown," she said. "Here we cleanse the mind. Clean minds make good wives, or at least tolerable ones." Eliza curtsied and said nothing. That seemed safest. The hallways were narrow and lined with oil paintings of solemn women holding prayer books or staring mournfully into gardens. The girls were not allowed to speak outside of lessons, meals, and prayer. Laughing was discouraged. Giggling was punished. Her roommate was a pale girl named Rosamund. She looked like she'd been pressed flat by years of sighing too quietly. She read psalms before bed, fingers trembling slightly as she did so. But Eliza noticed things. Rosamund's eyes flicked toward her more than necessary. Once, Eliza caught her watching as she undid the buttons on her dress at night. Their gazes met for a second too long. Rosamund blushed, dropped her eyes, and began murmuring the Lord's Prayer. In the classroom, they studied French and needlework, and the lives of saints, especially the saints. Saint Cecilia, Saint Agnes, Saint Catherine, Saint Lucy, all girls who had died young, virginal, and defiant in ways the school deemed acceptable. The stories were told with great reverence, but Eliza found them unnerving. The way the teachers described the women's purity sounded more like obsession than admiration. Their deaths were lingered on in too much detail. When they read about Saint Agnes refusing a suitor and being paraded naked through the streets, one teacher clutched her chest and whispered, "Such sacred suffering." At night, in their shared room, Eliza would hear Rosamund whispering these stories under her breath, as though reciting them was some secret key to surviving the place. "I don't think suffering is sacred," Eliza said once, staring at the ceiling. Rosamund turned toward her, eyes wide. "They were strong," Rosamund whispered. "They resisted." "But why was that the only thing they were praised for?" Eliza said. "Why is resisting the only story we get?" Rosamund said nothing, but her breathing quickened. The next morning, Eliza's copy of the Saints' Lives had been removed from her desk. A note sat in its place. "Your thoughts are unladylike. Repent." There was no signature. The school had strange customs. Once a week, the girls were brought to the silence room, a candlelit space filled with religious paintings and a velvet-covered prayer bench. Each girl was expected to kneel and reflect on her sins. A teacher watched from behind a screen. No one ever spoke about what happened there. Eliza's first time came in her second week. She knelt in the dim room, the candles flickering like nervous hearts. A draft moved through the chapel. She could feel someone behind the screen. She closed her eyes and waited. She was supposed to confess, but what could she say? That her heart beat faster when Rosamund touched her arm during sewing lessons. That she dreamed of kissing someone she wasn't supposed to. The silence stretched. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but I'm not ashamed." A sharp inhale behind the screen. She waited for rebuke, for scripture, but none came. Just a rustle, then the sound of soft footsteps retreating. She stood, light-headed, and left the room. The next day, during embroidery, Rosamund passed her a folded piece of muslin. It had a flower stitched onto it, a rose. Underneath, in the smallest thread, was a single word. Yes, that night, they kissed. It was tentative and trembling, but real. It felt like crossing a boundary no one had marked aloud, but everyone had always known was there. Afterward, Rosamund began to weep. "We're going to hell," she whispered. "No," Eliza said. "We're just not pretending anymore." From then on, they were careful. They barely spoke in public. They shared glances across the pews during morning prayer. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind was loud and the doors creaked just enough to mask their movement, they met in the laundry cellar. It smelled of soap and wet stone, and it was always cold, but the risk made it warmer. But nothing stayed secret at Thistledown for long. One morning, Rosamund didn't appear at breakfast. Mrs. Hargrave's eyes settled on Eliza during roll call. Later, Eliza found her own trunk had been searched. Her diary was gone. That evening, she was summoned to the headmistress's study. The fire crackled low. The door shut behind her with a sound that felt too final. Eliza stood stiff in front of Mrs. Hargrave's desk, hands clenched behind her back. The firelight made the shadows dance on the paneled walls, and for a brief second, she thought she saw the painting of St. Agnes frown. The headmistress didn't speak at first. She opened a drawer slowly, deliberately, and placed Eliza's diary on the desk like it was a weapon. "I've read your confessions," she said. "They're not confessions," Eliza replied, voice steady. "They're thoughts." Mrs. Hargrave's lip twitched. "Thoughts," she echoed. "Wicked ones, perverted ones, leading another girl into sin." "She wasn't led," Eliza said. "She walked beside me." That earned her a slap. Not hard, but sharp enough to sting. The air between them tightened. "I had hoped," the headmistress said, "that a few months here would scrub out the sickness." Eliza looked at the fire. "It's not sickness. It's just not yours. Do you want to be saved?" Mrs. Hargrave hissed. "Or are you so far gone you'd drag others with you into damnation?" "I don't need saving," Eliza said. "I need honesty." There was a long silence. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant tolling of the chapel bell. "Rosamund has been moved," Mrs. Hargrave said coldly. "Her parents have been informed." Eliza's heart clenched. "You will write a letter," she continued, "confessing your unnatural urges, and asking for forgiveness. You will read it aloud in chapel, or you will be dismissed and sent home in disgrace." Eliza swallowed. Her voice was quieter now. "What if I refuse?" "Then your shame will follow you," Mrs. Hargrave said, "and every door that might have opened for you will stay shut. Marriage, station, family, all of it gone." Eliza said nothing. The diary was pushed toward her. A quill lay beside it, but she didn't pick it up. She turned and walked out. She didn't cry. Not when she returned to her room. Not when she saw Rosamund's side of the wardrobe empty. Not when she pressed her hand to the wall where their beds touched and whispered her name once, quietly. 3 days later, her mother arrived in a tightly laced bodice and a tighter frown. No explanations were given. Just silence and a carriage ride full of disapproval. Thistledown shrank behind her, its windows blank and unblinking. Months later, Eliza would find a letter tucked inside an old psalm book that had somehow ended up with her trunk. It was stitched into the binding with pink thread. It read, "I remember the cellar. I remember the rose. I remember that it was real. Yours always." The Merrow estate was perched on the edge of Somerset like it had been dropped there by mistake, too grand for a family barely clinging to respectability. Eliza returned to it under a shroud of silence, the scandal from Thistledown trailing behind her like the hem of a torn gown. Her mother didn't speak of the dismissal, not directly. She didn't need to. She made her disappointment known in narrowed glances, in the way she pinched her lips each time Eliza entered the room, and in the sudden intensification of lessons in etiquette, prayer, and needlepoint. "You'll marry early now," her mother said over tea one afternoon, her words clipped and casual. "You've caused enough fuss. A well-placed match will correct the rumors." "I didn't realize marriage was a form of punishment," Eliza muttered. Her mother's teacup clinked a little too loudly into its saucer. "It is a correction, not a punishment, and one you will embrace." Eliza said nothing, but inside, she seethed. The days blurred into a repetition of sighs and silence. Her world shrank to parlor chairs, garden walks, and the same 2 novels she was allowed to reread. She thought often of Rosamund, of her hands trembling in the candlelight. of the cellar and the rose, of the way she had whispered always, like a prayer. Weeks passed, then months, and then, on a Tuesday thick with heat, a letter arrived. It was handed to her during a dull embroidery lesson with her aunt, who looked at the strange handwriting with suspicion. "I've never seen a seal like that," the aunt said. Eliza examined the wax pressed into it was a rose, just like the one Rosamund had stitched. Her breath caught. She excused herself politely and fled to the garden, under the shade of an old ash tree. She broke the seal with shaking fingers. "Dearest Eliza, I have been moved to Wiltshire, to an estate kept by my uncle. It is quieter here, but not peaceful. My parents have made it clear that Thistledown was my last chance. I am to be made a ward of the church next spring, they say. I must redeem myself, and this is the only way to do it without shame. I suppose you understand, but I do not feel shame. Not for what we shared, not even now. If you can come before winter, I will wait. There is a folly at the edge of the woods behind the house. Ask the gardener for the path called Fox's Hollow. I will leave a lantern burning every third night, should you arrive. But if you cannot know that I carry you with me always." Rosamund Eliza read it 3 times, her hands trembling more with each pass. Waiting, a chance. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her bodice, and stood. That night, she stole ink and paper from the study, and wrote a note of her own. It wasn't addressed to her mother, nor signed. She left it on her pillow, simple and stark. "I am not yours to correct." By dawn, she was gone. The journey to Wiltshire took nearly a day. She wore a borrowed riding cloak, kept her hood low, and paid in coins she'd hidden in a jar in the root cellar for years. She rode a mail coach most of the way, sharing a bench with a butcher's wife and a drooling mastiff Dot at the crossroads. Near Warminster, she descended. The air was cool, and the sky beginning to bruise with evening. She asked the stable boy for directions to the Hollingbrook estate. He eyed her up and down, noting the fine boots under her travel dress, and pointed. "West. You're late," he said, with the strange insight of country folk. "Should have come while the trees still had color." Eliza walked the rest of the way, feet aching, heart drumming. The estate loomed in the fading light of E-list stone and shuttered windows. It was more fortress than home. She didn't approach the main house. Instead, she skirted the perimeter, ducking behind hedgerows until she found the path. Fox's Hollow it wound, through twisted trees and bramble, the ground slick with wet leaves. And there, ahead, a small stone folly stood like a forgotten chapel, wrapped in vines and moss Dot inside. A single lantern glowed. Eliza stepped into the doorway, breathless. Rosamund sat on a worn blanket, her hair loose, her hands wrapped around the lantern. She looked older, thinner, but her eyes widened with the same startled warmth. "Eliza," she breathed, and then they were holding each other, not kissing, not speaking, just holding, like time itself had paused to catch its breath. "I didn't think you'd come," Rosamund whispered against her neck. "I didn't think I'd stop wanting to," Eliza replied. They stayed in the folly until the stars came out. Rosamund had brought bread, cheese, and a small flask of sweet wine. They talked in low tones about Thistledown, about the emptiness of days and the strange cruelties of silence, about how sometimes remembering love was more painful than forgetting it. "I think they're trying to erase me," Rosamund said at one point. "They can't," Eliza said. "I remember every word, every look." Rosamund reached out and touched her cheek. "You still blush like you used to." The folly became their sanctuary. Eliza found work nearby as a governess under an assumed name, watching over a widower's wild children. She saved every coin. Every third night, she returned to the folly. They made rules: no names in public, no letters unless urgent. If the lantern was lit, it meant Rosamund had arrived safely. If it wasn't, Eliza would wait till the next time. Winter crept in. Their meetings became harder, colder, but no less vital. Rosamund brought blankets, and once, a tattered book of Sappho's poetry hidden beneath a Bible binding. They read it by lantern light, fingers entwined. But secrets, like ivy, always find cracks. One bitter night in December, Eliza found the folly dark. She waited until dawn, pacing, heart hammering. No sign. The next night, the same, and then a week. Finally, she dared approach the estate itself. She watched from the trees as men loaded a carriage. At its center stood Rosamund, pale and unmoving, her hands bound in front of her with ribbon. A priest stood beside her. "She has agreed to enter St. Etheldredus in London," he told a watching footman. "She's to begin her novitiate at the New Year." Eliza stepped back, heart fracturing. She returned to the folly that night, numb with grief. There, on the blanket, was a final note. They found the book. "I said it was mine alone. I said I sinned in thought, not in deed. It was the only way to spare you. I couldn't let them take you, too. If you're reading this, I hope you are safe. I hope you forget me enough to live, but not so much you lose the truth, always." The paper was damp, the ink smudged. Eliza held it close. She stayed until the sun rose, then walked back down the path. Years passed. Eliza moved to Manchester, where no one knew her name. She worked in a print shop by day and wrote essays by candlelight. She joined a quiet circle of women who discussed suffrage and science, not saints. She wore her hair loose and her neckline higher, but she never forgot. One spring morning, she passed a small chapel tucked between two warehouses. A choir practiced inside. Through the stained glass, she saw a young nun placing flowers by a statue. It wasn't her. Of course it wasn't. But for a heartbeat, she imagined it could be. Back home, she opened the old psalm book Rosamund had once sewn shut and pressed a dried rose between the pages. The scent had faded, but the petals held. Eliza had not spoken Rosamund's name aloud since she left Thistledown. She had mouthed it in dreams, traced it in the steam on her bedroom window, and once, in a moment of aching solitude, written it with a quill across the linen of her underthings, where no one would see. But the house was different now. She was back, not by choice, but because her mother had taken ill something vague and lingering, the kind of affliction that allowed servants to whisper words like hysteria or melancholy, and Eliza had been called home to fill her place. Her father had changed little. He still wrote in silence in the study, still ignored her, unless she curtsied first. He referred to her simply as the girl. And so, for the first time in years, Eliza had room to think at night. She walked the garden paths with a lantern, the flames small against the boughs of bare trees. The estate grounds were quiet, overgrown, untouched by the hands of any real gardener since her mother had taken to her room. The rose garden had gone wild, brambles stretching like fingers across the gravel path. A single bloom remained, pale and defiant, pressed against a broken trellis. Eliza touched its petals. "You're still here," she murmured, in the hush. Something stirred behind her. She turned, heart seizing. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, half lit by her lantern. The cloak was dark, the bonnet pulled low but the way she stood. Slight inward turn of her feet, the shape of her mouth. Eliza stepped forward. "Rosamund." The figure vanished. She ran. Branches snatched her dress. The lantern swung wild. She crashed through hedges, through thorns, calling the name she hadn't said in years. But there was no one, only the wind and the aching pitch of absence. When she returned to the house, blood traced her calves where the thorns had kissed too deep. Her maid, Clara, paled. "Eliza," she whispered, "you're not well." "I'm not mad," she snapped. "I saw her, in the trees." "Yes." Clara hesitated. "That's not the first time someone's said such a thing." Eliza turned, frozen. The last housemaid ran off in tears. Said she saw a girl standing by the roses at dawn. When the sun rose, there were boot prints in the dew. "Boot prints, faint ones," Clara said, "leading to the east wall." The east wall. Eliza crept to the library. It hadn't been used in years. The curtains were thick with dust, and the hearth was cold. But the east wall lined with travel volumes and histories hid a small, warped door, one she'd found as a child, and once used to sneak biscuits. It groaned open. Behind it, stone steps leading down, and something faint, just the hint of it lingered in the air. Lavender. Eliza descended. It was not a dungeon, not a crypt. It was a servant's passage, one of many old households had. This one led to the garden's edge, perhaps once a way for cooks to retrieve herbs without walking through the house. But it had been used. Fresh mud smeared the stone. A candle stub sat in a nook. And on the final stair, something soft and pink. The scrap of cloth, she picked it up, stitched into the hem. Eliza sat before the fire that evening, tea untouched. Rosamund had been here. She had walked this house, breathed this air. Eliza did not know if she had been followed or summoned, or if perhaps fate had finally taken pity. But the certainty sat in her bones, like a truth older than the gospel. She went to the chapel. The next day, her family's private one, nestled between the old barn and the orchard. The altar was cold and austere. Behind it, tall windows bore saints with blank expressions. She knelt. "Are you still waiting?" she whispered. "Do you think I abandoned you?" A creak, a breath. Eliza turned nothing. She stood and walked the aisle, hand brushing pews. And then, something glimmered on the wood, scratched into the grain. The outline of a rose. She pressed her fingers to it. It warmed in the weeks that followed. The hauntings grew. She never saw Rosamund fully. Only the back of a cloak, a shadow at the window, a braid slipping out of sight behind a tree. But she heard her once. While combing her hair before bed, a voice whispered behind her, "You left the door open." Eliza turned. Nothing. Another time, a petal fell from the rafters, onto her shoulder. And then came the book. It was waiting on her pillow one morning, bound in worn red leather. Inside were poems written in a careful, feminine hand, each one about longing, about fire, about hands brushing in secret, about kisses in silence. One poem bore her name in the title. Beneath it, a pressed violet. Eliza pressed the book to her chest. "Where are you?" She followed clues. Footprints in the frost. Notes hidden behind paintings. A trail of half-sketched roses carved in chalk beneath windowsills. Each one led her deeper into the house's hidden bones. And finally, one evening, into the old west wing, long sealed after a fire decades earlier. The door was stuck. She forced it open. The hallway inside was scorched, but intact. Ash still clung to the wallpaper. The air smelled faintly of burnt sugar, and at the end of the hall, a bedroom. Inside, a bed with iron posts, a dressing mirror covered in a shroud, a wardrobe with cracked glass, and on the wall, a portrait to girls. One was Eliza, the other Rosamund. Eliza stepped closer. She remembered this moment. A secret artist who came to Thistledown, sketching the girls for a patron's amusement. He'd caught them laughing, whispering something terrible in her ear. She had never seen the final piece. She hadn't known it had survived. Beneath, it etched into the wood. "Sanctuary, Eliza," came a voice behind her. She turned. Rosamund stood in the doorway. She looked older only slightly. Her dress was simple, her cheeks thinner, but it was her. "Rosamund." "I waited, I know." Rosamund's voice trembled. "I thought you'd forgotten." "I never did," Eliza whispered. "They took you from me." "No," Rosamund said they couldn't. "I left." Eliza stared. "You ran." Rosamund nodded. "They wanted to send me to Ireland, a convent, but I slipped away. I found an old nurse of mine. She took me in, all these years. I came back for you," she said, "when I thought it was safe. But they said you'd gone to London, that you'd married." "I never did," Eliza said. "They sent me home, said I was unfit." Their hands found each other. Eliza's breath caught. "It was not a dream." "You wrote to me," Eliza whispered. Rosamund nodded. "I left the book, the notes. I waited to see if you'd follow." "I did," she said. And then Rosamund kissed her. It was not desperate. It was not stolen. It was long, quiet, and true. That night, the west wing was lit with candles. The two girls sat on the bed, the fire crackling in the hearth. "What now?" Eliza asked. Rosamund smiled. "We can't stay here." "No, but I've saved," she said. "Enough for passage. There's a woman's house in Paris. They take women like us, painters, writers, scholars, unnatural women, Eliza teased. "The best kind." Eliza turned the idea over in her mind. To leave this place. To begin something new. With Rosamund, yes, she said. They rose before dawn, packed few things. A book, a ring, a vial of lavender oil. Eliza left a letter on her pillow, unsigned. Clara met them at the garden gate. "You'll need coin," she whispered, pressing a pouch into Eliza's hand. "And food." "You knew?" Eliza asked. "I'm not blind," she said. "Be quick. The house stirs at 5. Rosamund squeezed her hand, and they vanished into the morning mist. Rain pattered like whispered gossip across the roof of the bookshop and bath. Eliza pressed her back to the inner door, her eyes still adjusting from the gray morning outside to the shadowy warmth within. The scent of beeswax, old parchment, and pipe smoke was a comfort, now her strange little sanctuary from the world that had tried to make her small dot. Mr. Sallow, the shop's owner, an unlikely savior, peered over his reading glasses and grunted without looking up. "You're late?" "There was a procession in the square," Eliza said, shaking the rain from her shawl. "They were preaching temperance again. I had to circle through the alley by the apothecary." Mr. Sallow gave no reply, only adjusted his spectacles and returned to his ledger. Eliza moved behind the counter, tucking loose strands of damp hair into her bonnet. She didn't mind the silence after 2 years in the Hargrave Institute. Silence was a relief. The bell over the door rang twice before noon. A widowed clergyman came in for another copy of Pilgrim's Progress, and a weary-looking maid bought a second-hand prayer book with coins wrapped in string. Eliza handled each sale with a polite nod, but her heart was far from the register. It had been 6 weeks since Rosamund's letter had reached her. 6 weeks since Eliza had pulled apart the binding of the psalm book and found the note sewn with pink thread, like some quiet miracle. She had read the letter so many times it was nearly memorized, every curve of Rosamund's hand, every deliberate press of the pen. "I remember the cellar. I remember the rose. I remember that it was real. Yours always." A dozen questions burned behind it. Where was she? Was she safe? Had she chosen this separation, or had it been forced upon her like everything else? And yet Rosamund had written always. Always meant hope. Eliza had written back twice, but no address had been given, no signature, no direction. So she wrote and folded the letters into the pages of her journal, hoping they might one day find their way to her. At 2:30, a man arrived with a new box of theology texts from Oxford. As she unpacked them in the rear storeroom, Eliza found her fingers trembling when she came to a volume wrapped in violet cloth. A scrap of lace had been tied around it like a ribbon dot. It was not standard practice. She unwrapped it slowly. The book inside was Lives of the Martyrs, a heavy thing with red-edged pages and an engraving of St. Catherine on the title leaf. Inside the front cover was a folded note. She unfolded it with deliberate slowness, afraid to hope. Thursday, after dusk. The Roman ruins were green. No name, no signature. But Eliza didn't need one. The Roman baths were closed at night, but the western ruins by the abbey were still open to the daring and the patient. Eliza stood under a crumbling archway, her green cloak gathered at the throat. Her breath steamed in the cold, and her heart raced with each gust of wind. She told herself she might have been wrong. It could be nothing, a cruel joke, a coincidence. But then a shadow moved beyond the pillars, a soft scrape of boot against stone. "Eliza." The voice cracked slightly, unsure. But Eliza would have known it in a storm. "Rosamund." They stared at each other a moment before stepping forward at once, hands grasping forearms, then shoulders, then tangled in each other's hair. "You came," Eliza whispered, face pressed to Rosamund's cheek. "I was never far," Rosamund replied. "Only watched." They pulled back, eyes searching. Rosamund had changed. She was thinner, a little paler, her hair pinned more severely. But her eyes, her storm-gray eyes, were exactly the same. "How did you find me?" I asked questions. Quietly, a woman at the bookshop said a clever girl with strange reading habits had taken up work there. I had my suspicions. And the note. Rosamund smiled faintly proud. "I bribed the delivery boy with rhubarb tart and brandy." Your Mr. Sallow doesn't watch the stock closely." They both laughed then, giddy and quiet, like girls stealing apples from the orchard. Rosamund touched her fingers to Eliza's collar. "You wore green. You asked me to." The ruins held them in shadow. Around them, the stones were slick with moss, but the past felt closer here, like the old gods still listened. They sat on a broken column, shoulders touching. "After I left Thistledown," Rosamund said softly, "my mother brought me to my uncle's estate near Hereford. She thought the country would clear my mind. I was not allowed to write letters or speak to anyone from school. And yet you wrote," Eliza said. "I sewed it into the book, left it in your trunk when no one was looking. I knew they'd never check the Psalms. They never did." Silence stretched between them. But it was not empty, it was heavy with unspoken things. "They tried to tell me what I had done," Rosamund whispered. "That I'd be ruined, that I was sick." Eliza stared at her. "And did you believe them?" "For a while. I prayed. I begged. I fasted." Rosamund looked down at her hands, but the memory of you was the only thing. That didn't feel like sin. Eliza reached for her fingers, lacing them slowly. "What now?" she asked. "I don't know," Rosamund admitted. "I only know I want more than shadows and silence." They leaned into each other. The chill was forgotten. "When I saw you, back then," Eliza said, "you were like something out of a story. And now I know you're real." "That's even better." They sat until the cathedral bells struck 10. The next weeks passed in a blur of notes and half-seen meetings. Rosamund rented a room above a dressmaker's shop on the edge of town and began offering piano lessons to wealthy widows. It was modest, but hers. She invited Eliza there twice, always after dark, always with the curtains drawn. They drank weak tea and stronger wine. They spoke of poetry, of science, of the mad pamphlets circulating about phrenology and magnetism. Eliza showed Rosamund the books she had smuggled from the shop, scandalous essays from the continent, even a novel from France where two women dared to live together without shame. "This," Rosamund whispered once, "is how they kept us apart. They made us think we were the only ones. And now we know better," Eliza said. But not everything was gentle. One day, Eliza returned to the shop to find Mr. Sallow unusually stern. He tapped the counter with his pipe. "Girl was here asking after you. Red bonnet. Freckles," said she. "Knew you from school." Eliza froze. "Did she give a name?" "Said it was Miss Sutton. Gave me this." He handed her a note, sealed in pink wax. She opened it in the alley behind the shop, hands shaking. "I know what you are. Meet me tomorrow, at noon by the mineral spring, where I tell it was signed, quite smugly, Harriet Sutton." Harriet Sutton had always been a meddler, the sort of girl who sniffed out secrets like a hound. She had once been caned for writing the names of suspected sinners in the back of her Bible. Eliza stood by the spring at noon, her fists in her cloak pockets. Harriet arrived with a parasol and a false smile. "Eliza," she said sweetly, "I'm glad you came. You look well. Not quite as washed out as at school. What do you want?" Harriet glanced about, lowered her voice. "I saw her," she said, "Rosamund, at the chapel. She walked right past me, but she didn't see me. I doubt she was looking for vipers." Harriet's smile thinned. "Here's how it is," she said. "I have a cousin at the Bath Gazette. He's always looking for scandal. You and Rosamund, well, that would sell rather well. You're threatening me, only suggesting an arrangement. You have access to rare books now. Latin ones, herbal ones. I want a copy of Diana's Mirror, you know the one." Eliza narrowed her eyes. Diana's Mirror was a banned manuscript full of rituals, folk cures, and recipes whispered to be unchristian. If I say no, then Rosamund's next lesson might be interrupted by a vicar. Or worse. Eliza stared at her, then smiled coldly. "I'll think on it." That night, she brought the matter to Rosamund. "We should leave," Rosamund said. "At once. Go to London, or Paris. Start again." But Eliza shook her head. "She won't stop, and she won't be the last." "What do we do then?" Eliza leaned in, her voice soft. "We give her Diana's Mirror." Rosamund frowned. But you said we don't have it. We don't, Eliza said. But we have books on Latin, on herbs, on ink, and packaging. We can make her believe we do. Rosamund blinked. You want to forge a spell book? I want to trap a snake. Rosamund's face slowly lit with mischief. Then we'd better start boiling paper. The train coughed smoke into the cold morning air as Eliza stepped down onto the platform in Oxford. Wrapped in her mother's old traveling cloak and boots, half a size too big. The city loomed in spires and domes beyond the station, golden buildings rising like fortresses of thought. She clutched her satchel close, inside which were tucked Rosamund's letter and the diary she had refused to destroy. A year had passed since this, and though she lived now with her great-aunt, in Wiltshire, woman as hard as granite and twice as silent, Eliza had written and rewritten her application to St. Hilda's College half a dozen times. She had not used the family name that carried too many whispers, nor included references from the school that had banished her, but her essay had burned with something fierce honesty, rebellion, a refusal to apologize for knowing desire. The interview had come with a short letter from a Miss Cartwright, Dean of Women, who requested a private conversation. Eliza could hardly believe the summons was genuine until she held the parchment in her own hand. She arrived at the college gate an hour early and wandered the edges of the green lawn, reading the Latin inscriptions carved above stone entrances. Girls in long coats passed her with books under arms, eyes bright with purpose. She'd never known a place could feel like a door, waiting to be opened. When she was led into Miss Cartwright's study, she saw the rows of books, first law, medicine, ancient Greek texts, and theological treatises, but also a small vase of dried lavender and a faded photograph on the desk of two women seated on a bench, holding hands in their laps. Miss Cartwright stood, tall and stern-faced, and offered no handshake. You are Miss Eliza Vale. I am. You wrote this. She lifted Eliza's letter. Yes. Miss Cartwright sat. And is it true that you were expelled from a girls' academy for unnatural affections? I wasn't expelled, Eliza replied, folding her hands. I left before they could. That made the woman raise an eyebrow. And you would bring that history with you here? I bring it with me wherever I go, Eliza said. It's not something I can leave behind. A long pause. Miss Cartwright glanced out the window before asking, Do you know who St. Hilda was? She was an abbess, Eliza replied quickly. She taught poetry, letters, science. She also believed visions came to women as often as men, said Miss Cartwright, and that God spoke in dreams. Another pause, and then, Miss Vale, what do you want here? Eliza took a breath. I want to learn. I want to read the histories. No one teaches. Ask the questions that are considered impolite. I want to write things that make people uncomfortable. Miss Cartwright considered her. You know what they'll say? That I'm unfit, that I'm dangerous, and are you? Eliza met her eyes. Only two lies. For the first time. A flicker of something not quite a smile softened the dean's face. You'll begin with theology and ancient history, she said, pulling out a second folder. There are gaps in your education, but I suspect you'll fill them quickly. And there's a private study group. I'll send you the address. Eliza blinked. I'm accepted. Miss Cartwright rose. You are invited. The private study group met on Thursdays in a drawing room off the Banbury Road, in a rented house filled with smoke and laughter and books stacked like city walls. There were 8 of them, mostly women, with one quiet man who translated Arabic texts and never spoke unless directly addressed. They drank too much port, quoted Ovid with blasphemous intent, and referred to St. Paul as that dreary apostle of shame. It was here Eliza first heard someone say the word sapphic out loud. It was whispered by a woman named Mabel in horn-rimmed glasses during a conversation on Roman poetry. Mabel read aloud a line from Sappho about limbs going slack with desire, and while some giggled, others nodded solemnly. No one blushed. Eliza sat stunned. It was as if the walls of Thistledown had been broken open. Later, she found Mabel on the balcony, smoking a Turkish cigarette. Do you think we're wicked? Eliza asked. Mabel exhaled. I think the world likes to call us that, but it's only because it doesn't know what else to call us. And what do you call us? Hungry, she said, and done with being starved. Letters came every fortnight, stamped with odd addresses in Yorkshire, and always unsigned. But Eliza knew the handwriting. Rosamund was alive, free, and full of small details. She was working as a governess to a family that did not ask too many questions. She had a room of her own and had cut her hair. She signed each letter with a single word. Still, Eliza kept them, pressed inside the cover of her diary. By Easter term, she had moved into a small attic room at the top of college housing. It was drafty and lit by candle, but it was hers. One night, while reading by firelight, she found a passage in a medieval manuscript about Marjorie Kemp, the Christian mystic who claimed visions of divine love in ways that made churchmen sweat, and scholars dismiss her as mad. Marjorie spoke of Christ as her lover, her husband, her joy. And for the first time, Eliza saw how sanctity and longing could be intertwined. She brought the passage to Miss Cartwright. "She sounds touched," the older woman said, frowning. "She sounds like she couldn't find the right words," Eliza countered. "Like maybe all women who feel too much get called mad or sinful when they're just desperate to speak." "And what would you call her, then?" "A mirror," said Eliza. "A kind of permission." Miss Cartwright tapped the edge of the page. "You'll need to choose your metaphors carefully. The line between reverence and blasphemy is thinner than you think." "I've walked thinner lines," Eliza said, smiling. Spring came with pale crocuses in the college garden and the taste of pollen on the wind. Eliza was seated under an oak with her books when Mabel dropped a note into her lap. "Meeting tonight," it said. "Not the study group. Something older." That night, Elisa followed her through side streets until they reached an old stone chapel just past the edge of the university quarter. Inside, the pews had been pulled aside to make room for cushions and lanterns. There were no priests, no texts, only candles, and women. Mabel whispered in her ear, "This is the circle of St. Agatha, for those who worship the truth of their own bodies." Eliza shivered. The ceremony was simple. They spoke aloud the names of women who had been burned, exiled, or erased. They read poems that could not be published. They sang a hymn not to God, but to something deeper and old kind of knowing. When Eliza was invited to speak, she rose slowly. "I was told once that desire made me monstrous," she said. "But I think what made me monstrous was refusing to hide it." She reached into her pocket and unfolded Rosamund's last letter. She said, "Still, I want to be still, too. Still in love, still in defiance, still here." There was silence. Then someone lit a candle for Rosamund and another for Eliza. The flame did not flicker. Weeks passed. Exams drew closer. Eliza worked harder than she ever had, and her essays began to circulate among faculty as examples of brilliance married to boldness. Miss Cartwright never praised her openly, but once, after class, she left a copy of the Book of the City of Ladies on Eliza's desk, inside a note, "For when the world tells you you're alone, you're not." One morning, a telegram arrived. It was unsigned but unmistakable. "Coming to Oxford. Mayday. White. Rose." Eliza's heart leaped. She wore the red ribbon from the cellar in her hair and waited on Magdalen Bridge among the crowd. Mayday was wild students, dancing, choirs, singing. From towers at dawn, garlands hung on railings. Then she saw her. Rosamund was thinner, and her hair was cropped close, but her smile was the same. She wore a coat a little too fine for a governess, and a white rose was pinned over her heart. They didn't run. They didn't cry. They simply walked toward each other and touched hands. "You're taller," Rosamund said. "You're late," Eliza replied. They walked through the streets as if Oxford had been built just for them, and in a hidden garden behind a chapel no longer used for prayer. They kissed, not in shadows, not in shame, but in daylight, among blooming things. Eliza ducked her head beneath the folds of Mrs. Turnbull's tattered lace parasol, her boots squelching through the slush on the edge of Tavistock Square. Behind her, the heavy sigh of carriages rattling by masked the sound of approaching footsteps. But she was always listening now, always wary. The world outside Thistledown was less polished than she'd imagined. Her mother's promise to keep her hidden until the gossip faded had dissolved into thin air within weeks. Her cousin's townhouse had refused her. So had the Bloomsbury aunts. In the end, it was Mrs. Turnbull, failed music teacher, who owed Eliza's mother a favor from some long-forgotten church raffle, who took her in. Mrs. Turnbull's tiny flat smelled of rosewater and boiled eggs, and though she never asked questions, her gaze lingered on Eliza like a priest judging a soul. But Eliza didn't mind. It was better than the deafening silence of her mother's sitting room. Or worse, the gossamer thread of conversion clinics whispered at Sunday teas. London, for all its smoke and vice, had freedom tucked in its corners, and one of those corners was the Stolen Season. It was a bookshop on a crooked lane near Seven Dials, tucked between a haberdashery and a bakery that sold die-old bread. The windows were perpetually fogged from within. On her first visit, she had stood across the street for 15 minutes, heart pounding, before finally stepping through the door. A bell had jingled. A woman in a plum waistcoat had looked up from a desk and said, "You're late." Eliza had blinked late. The woman had smiled. For your life. Her name was Hester. She wore a pince-nez and smelled faintly of ink and old roses. She had led Eliza to the back of the shop without another word, past shelves filled with dog-eared volumes and velvet-bound ledgers with spines too worn to read. There, behind a curtain of heavy tapestry, was the real shop. The shelves here held books that had never seen daylight. French novels with censored passages restored by hand. Latin treatises on the nature of desire. Anonymous English poetry written in the margins of cookbooks. And Eliza would later learn handwritten diaries from girls who had passed through Thistledown and similar institutions. Each one tucked in a velvet folder and coded with initials. Some had crossed oceans. Others had never left Kent. All of them had been punished for the same thing. Feeling the shop became her sanctuary. Hester never asked Eliza's real name. Too many real names become weapons, she'd said once, handing Eliza a book titled The Moon's Second Face. Choose a new one for here. Eliza will do, she'd replied quietly. Then Eliza, you are. By her third visit, Eliza had learned to bring coins. By the sixth, Hester trusted her to work the front counter when she stepped out. On Sundays, when the streets were quieter, a small group gathered in the back. Women of all types, and occasionally a man or two, all with soft voices and stories hidden in their hems. They called themselves the Lamplighters, not a formal club, not a political movement, not yet but a constellation of survivors who refused to forget their own names. Some of them still wore wedding rings, others had run from them. One woman, Marguerite, was a former governess who now wrote erotic sonnets under a male pseudonym and submitted them to Parisian journals. You ever hear back from her? She asked Eliza one week, half a biscuit in her hand. Eliza didn't need to ask who she meant. She shook her head. Sometimes, Marguerite said, the lost ones circle back. You just have to stay lit. That summer, Hester handed her a letter. It was folded simply, but the paper was thick and the wax seal bore no mark. No postmark, Hester noted. Dropped off by hand. Eliza's fingers trembled. She knew before she opened it. I heard you breathe once, in the cellar. When you were asleep, you curled toward me like ivy. I do not know where you've gone, but I walk past Thistle Garden Gate and listen. Just in case. -R. It wasn't a declaration, not even a promise, but it was a sound. A voice in the dark. Eliza placed it in the drawer beneath the till, under a stack of unused bookmarks, and let it sit there like a coal waiting to be kindled. Autumn came with its winds like whispers, and Mrs. Turnbull announced one morning between coughs that she was going to the seaside to take the cure. Eliza offered to find other lodgings, but the old woman waved her off. You're better off here than in a nunnery. Eliza took over the rent with what she earned at the shop. She spent less on herself and more on candles and preserves. At night, she read by the fire in the cramped parlor and wrote never diaries anymore, but letters she didn't post. Letters she couldn't stop writing. Dear R, I wonder what your hair smells like now. Dear R, do you still sing when you think no one's listening? Dear R, do you ever say my name in the dark? She never signed them. She folded them and tucked them into books like pressed flowers. It was Hester who said it, one November morning, when the rain turned the cobbles into glass. "She's in town, you know." Eliza looked up. Who? But Hester was already shelving a volume on botanical poisons. "A girl came in yesterday, pale, russet curls. Hesitated at the door. Bought Saints and Sinners, a catechism of the flesh. Asked if we had anything by. Initials." Eliza's heart squeezed. "Did she say a name?" Hester shook her head, but her eyes looked like yours when you first came in. For the rest of the day, Eliza barely moved from the window. She did not come. The snow arrived early that year. On the third night of frost, Eliza locked up the shop alone. Hester was visiting someone ill in Whitechapel, and the neighborhood was unusually silent as she turned the corner into the alley shortcut toward her flat. She paused. Someone stood at the far end, a girl. Her silhouette was familiar. Not just the slope of the shoulders or the tilt of the head, but the stillness. The same stillness Eliza had seen in the candlelit halls of Thistledown, when the wind scratched at the panes and they'd lain beneath thin blankets, listening to each other breathe. "Rosamund," she whispered. The figure turned. They stood, staring at one another, until Eliza stepped forward, and then the girl ran, not away. Toward her, they met halfway between two puddles of moonlight. Boots sloshing in the slush, arms tangled in the kind of embrace that pressed memory into muscle. Eliza clutched her as if afraid the girl might vanish again. And Rosamund buried her face into Eliza's scarf and said, "I thought you'd be gone. I thought you'd hate me." "I waited," Eliza whispered. They stood there for a long time. Neither cared who saw Rosamund's new lodgings were above a seamstress's on Gower Street. Her aunt, who disapproved of Thistledown's moral rigidity, had taken her in quietly, letting society assume she'd simply been unwell. "I lied," Rosamund confessed. "I said I had fever, that I remembered nothing." Eliza curled. Beside her, on a worn divan, traced a finger along her wrist. "Do you remember everything? Every breath?" They didn't rush into declarations. There were still scars, fresh and stinging. But there were also Saturdays, and shared scones, and books left dog-eared on purpose. Sometimes they sat in the back room of the stolen season, watching the lamplighters, speak softly, and said nothing at all. They didn't need to. One evening, Hester gave them a parcel. "No return address," she said, "and no postmark." Inside was a book. The cover bore no title. Inside, handwritten in precise ink, were 50 pages. It began, "For the girls with ruined reputations and unbeheaded hearts, for those whose love did not die, even when buried." Eliza turned to the final page. There, in a delicate script, was one line. "This time, the cellar is open." The summer of 1851 dragged itself over London like a heavy quilt. The heat was thick and clinging, caught between cobblestones and chimney soot. Even the cats on rooftops had stopped chasing mice and instead sprawled in silence, watching the days pass. Eliza, however, was in motion. She moved through the back alleyways of Bloomsbury, her dress hitched slightly above her ankles, revealing scuffed boots. She hadn't worn anything fashionable in over a year. A shawl of sensible wool lay over her shoulders, and a plain bonnet shadowed her face. She might have looked like a governess or a schoolteacher, but not one a respectable family would hire. Her hands still bore ink stains, but today she carried no diary, just a scrap of crumpled paper and the pink-stitched binding of Rosamund's letter, now worn thin from touch. She stopped in front of a small tea shop, newly painted with the sign sisters, Parlour. There were no customers, yet it was still early, but the curtains inside were drawn with care. The roses at the doorstep were fresh, and the brass doorbell chimed with a gentle tone. Eliza stepped inside. The scent of cardamom and ginger filled her nose. A young woman was bent over a tray of mismatched china, arranging cups with a deliberate rhythm. Her hair was hidden beneath a cap, but the line of her neck, the shape of her shoulders, made Eliza's heart quicken. She waited. The woman turned. Rosamund, a beat past. The quiet kind that held breath and weight. "Eliza," she said, voice breaking. "You're here," Eliza whispered. "I kept the rose," Rosamund said, smiling, "even after the nuns burned everything else." "I never stopped writing," Eliza said, stepping closer. Even when I had to burn my own pages, they stood inches apart now. In the dim lamplight, Rosamund's freckles had multiplied. Her lips parted to speak again, but she stopped herself, reached out, and touched Eliza's wrist instead. No slap, no curtain to pull shut between them, just warmth. "I thought I imagined you," Rosamund murmured. "Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking of the cellar and think, no girl would do that." "Not really, I did," Eliza said. "You did." Rosamund nodded slowly, then stepped aside. "Come in. There's still no one else who knows how to make a proper cup of tea." Inside the little shop, the walls were lined with books, not holy texts or etiquette manuals, but paperbacks, foreign novels, banned poetry. There were tiny vases of lavender on each table. A poster near the front window read, "Meetings for the Women's Reading Circle, Thursday nights." Below it, in neat script, "Questions are welcome." Eliza laughed softly. "You've made a sanctuary." Rosamund poured tea into mismatched cups. "They told me I was a disgrace, that no girl like me could belong anywhere, and now I made a place where we do." They sat across from each other, hands close, but not yet touching. "Did they ever find out about the letter?" Eliza asked. "No," Rosamund said. "But they found the roses under my bed, crushed, wilted." "What did they say?" Rosamund smiled, not kindly. "They said Satan wore perfume now." Eliza nearly spat her tea. "They said," Rosamund continued, "that temptation makes a garden bloom even in stone." I took it as a compliment. They drank in silence for a while, letting the clock tick. Outside, the street was beginning to stir. Footsteps passed. A delivery boy whistled. A woman shouted at a carriage driver. But inside the tea shop, time slowed to something tender. "Eliza," Rosamund said, "there's more." She reached beneath the counter and brought out a tin box, dented and tied with ribbon. Inside were letters, dozens of them written in ink faded to brown. Pages filled with secrets and softness, confessions and courage. "From girls?" Eliza asked. "From everywhere," Rosamund said. "Letters sent to a ghost name I printed in a radical pamphlet last year. They thought I was a myth, but you're not. I'm real," she said. "We're real." Eliza touched the paper with reverence. "You made a world. I want you to write it," Rosamund said. Eliza looked up. "All of it," Rosamund continued. "Not just our story, but theirs too. The stolen kisses and locked wardrobes and beds pushed too close together. The cold baths and warm hands. The punishments, the escapes. The girls who burned and the ones who refused. Will they let it be printed?" "Not in any respectable paper," Rosamund said. "But that's not where the truth belongs." She stood, walked to the back wall, and unlatched a small door. Behind it, in what used to be a pantry, was a tiny press. Ink pots, stamps, stencils. "A stack of paper I learned from a printer's apprentice," Rosamund said. "He thought I was just flirting. And were you?" Eliza teased. I was watching his hands. They both laughed. And that laughter, that was the sound the world outside had tried to silence. That was the sin the parlor was built to protect. It wasn't desire that threatened the empire, Eliza realized. It was joy. That night, long after the last customer left, the two of them sat on the parlor floor, surrounded by letters, stringing stories together like beads. Eliza dipped her pen into the ink, her fingers sure again for the first time in months. They lit a single candle in the corner. Its glow stretched toward the ceiling, casting their shadows tall and dancing across the pages. And in that soft, flickering light, they wrote, "Once upon a time, two girls in a boarding school kissed in the dark. And though they were told it was a sin, they knew it was a beginning."